The man known to history as Erich von Manstein was born on the 24th of November 1887 in Berlin. His full name was Fritz Erich Georg Eduard von Manstein, a name which clearly indicated his aristocratic background. His father was Eduard von Lewinsky, a general of the Prussian military and an aristocrat of that same state. The Prussian state was the largest of the dozens of Germanic states in the early 19th century. In 1871, under its highly skilled political leader Otto von Bismarck, Prussia had succeeded in uniting the various German states into a new German empire, one which was dominated by Prussia. Thus, von Manstein was born into a family that was high up in the aristocracy and military of not just Prussia, but the new German Empire. Erich's mother was Helena von Sperling. Erich was his parents' 10th son, and because Helena's younger sister Hedwig was unable to have children with her husband Georg von Manstein, they allowed the couple to adopt Erich. Thus, while Erich's biological parents were Eduard and Helena von Lewinsky, his adoptive parents were Georg and Hedwig von Manstein, and it was that name he would bear throughout his life. However, whether it was his von Lewinsky relations or his von Manstein adoptive family, nearly all of them were involved in the Prussian military. In total, nearly 24 members of Erich's immediate or close family were members of the Prussian military, and as scions of the Prussian aristocracy, a huge number of them were also of the officer class. Thus, there was little doubt as to what career young Erich would be encouraged to enter into. This video is brought to you by Goat Games and their spectacular hero collector fantasy RPG, Bloodline Heroes of Lithas, an amazing game in which you can collect champions, build kingdoms, create legendary heirs of your houses by combining the forces of various bloodlines such as orcs, lycans, demons and dragonborn, all in amazing 3D graphics. In this amazing fantasy world, new legends will be born. You can find yourself the best companions and raise heirs. You can switch genders of companions freely, and the higher your companion's intimacy, the more powerful your offspring will be. Using unique gacha gameplay and easy-to-use controls, you can customize your champions by marrying different bloodlines and developing your family tree to define your 5 powerful abilities from a choice of dozens. Use my link and get the Clan of Karg Dragonborn for free. They can transform into real dragons. Download and try out the game now. It's free to play for both Android and iOS. To try out Bloodline Heroes of Lithas, hit the link in the video description or scan my QR code on screen and you will receive an exclusive starter pack worth $20, including 20 intimacy packs and 100,000 gold, plus 100 diamonds, available only for the next 30 days. Build your own kingdom and economy. The possibilities are endless. Erich grew up surrounded by military icons, although the new German state was largely at peace in the 1890s when he was growing up. It had not always been so. Back in the 1860s and early 1870s, when Prussia was still one of many German states, it had engaged in a series of wars with Denmark, Austria, and then France. In the course of these, it had succeeded not just in acquiring new territories from these 3 countries in regions like Schleswig-Holstein in the north and Alsace and Lorraine in the west, but it had also brought the 30 or so other German states such as Bavaria into a pan-German alliance. Eventually, following a speedy victory in the Franco-Prussian War, which Prussia initiated in 1870, a new German empire was declared in 1871. This united the German states into one country, but it was dominated from its inception by Prussia, which had already controlled vast parts of northern and eastern Germany, as well as parts of what is now northwestern Poland. As such, even as a new German state came into existence, its military was dominated by Prussian military families such as the von Mansteins. This would remain the case well into the 20th century and would shape the course of Erich's life. In line with his family's background, young Erich was sent to the Lyceum, a pre-military training school in Strasbourg, in 1894 when he was just 7 years of age. The German state had established a major military presence here in the foremost city of the region of Alsace and Lorraine, which it had conquered from France 20 years earlier. This was a provocative act, one which was indicative of the rising tensions across Europe over the emergence of Germany as the foremost political, military, and economic power on the continent, one which now rivaled Britain as a European power. In Strasbourg, von Manstein began some early elements of his training to become a military officer one day. Then, in 1899, he advanced to a cadet school, where he was widely interpreted as being an above-average student during his teenage years. In the mid-1900s, he began advanced training at various locations, eventually within the Prussian War Academy in Berlin. This would last years, through to the early 1910s, and as it was occurring, Europe was increasingly dividing into two armed military alliances, one headed by Germany and including the massive Austro-Hungarian Empire, the other consisting essentially of Britain, France, and Russia. Tensions between these two armed camps would soon escalate in ways that would shape von Manstein's life and the history of the 20th century. In the summer of 1914, the growing tensions between Europe's major powers finally spilled over into direct conflict following a regional crisis in the Balkans involving the assassination of the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In early August, Austria, Hungary, and Germany declared war on Britain, France, and Russia, one after another. The German military plan was to launch an assault into northern France through Belgium with the goal of seizing Paris quickly and knocking France out of the war, as had been done at the time of the Franco-Prussian War, nearly half a century earlier. To this end, von Manstein was quickly involved on the Western Front, notably the significant capture of the town of Namur and the surrounding fortifications in the first weeks of the conflict. However, he was quickly transferred thereafter to the Eastern Front in Poland, where the Germans were beginning their plans to confront the Russians. The war would soon stagnate into a stalemate on both fronts, with extensive trench warfare in northeastern France in particular. What is significant about von Manstein's transfer between the two arenas is that in 1914 and 1915, he gained experience of Germany waging war in both Western and Eastern Europe, something which provided him with a basis for devising strategies in both theatres many years later. Von Manstein was shot and injured late in 1914 and spent 6 months back in Germany recuperating. However, thereafter he was redeployed to both the Eastern Front against the Russians and in the Balkans, where a complex war was being fought, with both alliances having acquired allies amongst countries such as Greece, Romania, and Bulgaria. Then, in 1916, he was sent back to France to play the role of a junior officer in the planning of offensive operations around the town of Verdun, in what would become one of the most significant engagements of the entire war on the Western Front. Thereafter, he was returned to the Eastern Front, and then to the Western Front again in 1918. All of this was vital training for the young von Manstein, who would not see a major war again until 1939. As a result, like many of the German officer class of the Second World War, his experiences of combat and command were shaped as a much younger man during the First World War. But it was ultimately an experience of defeat. In 1917, the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and France, and with the increased resources available to the Atlantic Allies filtering into France, Germany found itself on the back foot militarily. This, combined with Germans being starved of basic resources at home, led to serious unrest in the country, which eventually spilled into violent disturbances. In early November 1918, the ruler of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, abdicated, and just days later, German surrender to Britain, France, and the Americans was agreed. The First World War was over. The terms under which the war was brought to an end were highly unfavorable to Germany. Although the country had gained massive tracts of land from Russia in a separate treaty in 1917, Britain and France forced the new Weimar Republic, which had taken control of Germany, to renounce this land and much more besides on Germany's eastern flank in order to create a new Polish state. Austria-Hungary also suffered a similar truncation, and entirely new countries came into existence in Central Europe, such as Czechoslovakia, formed out of lands which had been formerly held by Germany and Austria-Hungary. On top of this, Germany was obliged under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the war officially to an end, to accept unequivocal guilt for having caused the war and to pay major war reparations for years to come in order to reimburse France and Belgium in particular for the devastation inflicted on their countries. In order to ensure this money was paid, the French and Belgians were allowed to occupy parts of Western industrial Germany for years to come. Finally, as a guarantee that Germany would not upset the future peace of Europe, a clause of the treaty also required the German Imperial Army to be disbanded entirely and replaced with a trimmed-down Reichswehr, which was not to exceed the size of 100,000 men. Furthermore, the country was completely prohibited from having its own air force. For the majority of German soldiers and officers, the Treaty of Versailles meant they lost their positions within the army. Not so for von Manstein, who had garnered a reputation as an effective strategist and logistician during the war. Accordingly, he was one of the chosen few who were retained as part of the Reichswehr into the 1920s. This was a period of immense unrest in Germany, as localized revolts in cities like Berlin and Munich broke out across the country in 1919 and 1920. The limited German military was consequently stretched thin trying to control the situation, and there were extensive opportunities for von Manstein to rise within the ranks. By 1921, he had been appointed as a company commander, and in the years that followed, he began teaching military history and tactics, before finally being promoted to the rank of major in 1927 and gaining appointment to the General Staff of the Reichswehr, the organizational command of the German military. Eventually, he would be appointed as a lieutenant colonel in the Reichswehr. He also became a family man during the 1920s, marrying Jutta Sibylle von Loesch in 1920 after a courtship of 3 days. They had 3 children in the years that followed: Gisela in 1921, Gero in 1922, and Rüdiger in 1929. These were not just formative years in von Manstein's military career and family life. The 1920s and early 1930s also saw the rise to power of an extremist group in Germany. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, had emerged from the fractured politics of Bavaria and the city of Munich in particular in the early 1920s. Led by an Austrian demagogue named Adolf Hitler, they were a fringe group who wanted to overturn the Versailles Treaty and impose an extreme form of racial politics on Germany, one which blamed groups such as the Jews for all of Germany's woes, and argued that new wars should be launched by a revitalized Germany to conquer vast territory from groups such as the Slavs of Eastern Europe, whom they viewed to be racially inferior. For much of the 1920s, they remained nothing more than a small party in Bavaria, with a following amongst the profoundly disaffected. But when the economies of the Americas and Europe were hit by the Wall Street crash, and then the Great Depression from 1929 onwards, their message of anger and revenge began to resonate with German voters. They made major gains in the Reichstag elections of 1930 and became the largest party in the country in 1932. Thus, after a brief period in which the centrist parties had attempted to block their path to power, Hitler was able to ascend as German Chancellor early in 1933. He and his followers quickly dismantled the Weimar Republic and created a one-party state. This would all have enormous consequences for von Manstein's future years. One of the first issues at hand for the Nazis upon seizing power in 1933 was to begin overturning the provisions within the Treaty of Versailles for Germany to remain largely demilitarized. A reorganization of the military saw von Manstein quickly promoted to the position of a full colonel in the spring of 1934. But the real shift began early in 1935 when Hitler announced to Britain and France that Germany intended to begin rebuilding its military to a strength of nearly 500,000 men, in direct violation of the Versailles Agreement. In tandem, a new air force named the Luftwaffe was to be established. As part of these measures, the administrative organization of the German military, renamed the Wehrmacht, was reformed in the months that followed. Von Manstein's talents were recognized when, on the 1st of July 1935, he was promoted to the position of head of the operations branch of the Army General Staff. This was effectively one of the most senior administrative and operational positions within the beating heart of the German military command in Berlin. and it was soon followed with an additional promotion to the rank of General Major, making von Manstein a senior military commander within the new German Wehrmacht. One might ask at this point exactly how close to the Nazi leadership von Manstein was. Was he an adherent of their political positions, or was he simply an army commander who fortuitously gained promotion as Hitler and the Nazis began rapidly expanding the German military in the 1930s? The answer is that there is extensive evidence to suggest that von Manstein's politics were very much in line with Nazi ideology. There is significant documentary evidence extant today which testifies to his belief that the twin forces of the Bolshevik communists of Soviet Russia and the Jews of Europe were joined in some imaginary plot to destroy the German people. As such, he perceived Germany's mission as being to prevent the rise to power of the Bolsheviks throughout Europe, backed by a Jewish conspiracy. There is also contradictory evidence which suggests that he was willing to oppose the Nazis on occasion. For instance, in 1934, he was one of the few German military officers who opposed the introduction of the so-called Aryan paragraph, a stipulation which was introduced into military doctrine that individuals had to have Aryan blood, which was code for German blood, in order to serve. However, overriding this again is von Manstein's speech at Hitler's 50th birthday in April 1939, in which he wholeheartedly endorsed the Nazi Party's racial and political ideologies and claimed that he would welcome a world war to see their vision implemented. He would not have long to wait. German remilitarization in 1935 had been just the first step in the country's advance to war. Originally, the Nazis had intended on waiting until 1941 or 1942 to go to war, but in the late 1930s, they realized that Britain and France's remilitarization was slow enough that they would be best to strike quickly. As a result, in 1938, Germany's foreign policy became more aggressive, annexing Austria into a Greater Germany in a quasi-military diplomatic coup in March of that year. Further land grabs on Czechoslovakia occurred in the autumn, but this simply prefigured the wholesale annexation of the country in the spring, as well as the seizure of some territory in the Baltic States region at the same time. By now, the British and French were declaring that they had had enough. If Hitler proceeded to try and make good on his claims to land in Poland, they informed Berlin they would have no option but to declare war in defense of Polish independence. This is exactly what happened in early September 1939 after Germany invaded the country. It was the beginning of the Second World War, which von Manstein had spoken of just months earlier at Hitler's birthday. Von Manstein was immediately involved in the war. Prior to the invasion of Poland, he had been promoted as the Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group South, who was to oversee the military incursion into Germany's eastern neighbor. In this new capacity, he played a significant role in developing the operation plan for the invasion. Here, one of his favored approaches, which he would advise Hitler to deploy in multiple theaters, was on display. It was von Manstein who advised that the 10th Army under Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau should attack in force to break through the Polish lines and then surround much of their forces west of the river Vistula. A thrust could then be made to seize the Polish capital, Warsaw, quickly. This approach of von Manstein's was partially integrated into the plan for the invasion. It proved effective and was one of the reasons why the campaign was so successful. Within weeks of invading Poland on the 1st of September 1939, the Germans were victorious, with the last remnants of resistance surrendering on the 6th of October. The occupation of Poland also provided the first opportunity for the Nazis to put their racial policies into operation on a major scale. Poland was home to over 3 million Jews, a figure which dwarfed the 500,000 or so who lived in Germany when they seized power there. Germany's Jews had already experienced increasing persecution since 1933, and many had decided to flee the country. But this would pale by comparison with what developed in Poland in the years that followed, as the Jewish people were rounded up into ghettos where a systematic policy of starvation was implemented. More immediately, von Manstein and his fellow commanders would have been aware of the first actions of the Einsatzgruppen, These were brigades of members of the SS, a paramilitary wing of the Nazis, comprising only the most ideologically committed members of the military. They were first deployed in Poland, traveling in the rear of the German army itself, and effectively mass murdering thousands of individuals who had been identified as potential leaders of any Polish resistance to German occupation. By early 1940, Operation Tannenberg, as it was codenamed, had led to the mass murder of over 100,000 Polish politicians, intellectuals, and other figures. These atrocities would become all too prevalent in Eastern Europe in years to come, and despite claims which von Manstein would later make that the commanders within the military did not approve of such actions, there was little to any resistance offered to the actions of the Einsatzgruppen by the commanders of the German army in Poland during the invasion and initial occupation. Von Manstein's contributions to the eastwards campaign into Poland had gained him greater respect, not just within the high command of the Wehrmacht, but also within the Nazi leadership. Accordingly, when the planning process got underway for a westwards drive into France to be launched in 1940, von Manstein's advice was listened to. There were competing theories as to how this offensive should be undertaken. The initial plan, codenamed Case Yellow, had largely been devised by Colonel General Walter von Brauchitsch and General Franz Halder of the Army High Command, in conjunction with their staff. This called for an approach similar to that which the Germans had attempted back in 1914, of skirting the main fortifications erected by the French in western France and instead invading through the Netherlands and Belgium. Von Manstein felt this would lack surprise and instead counselled Hitler that the attack should also have a wing, move in strength along a more southerly line through the Ardennes forest region of Luxembourg, southern Belgium and northeastern France. This would largely outflank the Maginot Line of defensive fortifications to the south, but would also allow the Germans to make a second pincer movement towards the coast, trapping the French and the British Expeditionary Force in between it and the more northerly force. Although many within the Army High Command were unconvinced of the merit of von Manstein's proposal, Hitler was won over by it and ordered the generals and their staff to incorporate elements of it into the wider plan for the invasion of France. This invasion ultimately came later than the Western Allies expected. After the quick conquest of Poland in the autumn of 1939, a period of unusual stability was seen as Germany prepared for its next move, and the British and the French desperately tried to rearm and conscript hundreds of thousands of troops. When hostilities did resume in the spring of 1940, it was only for the purposes of a brief campaign in which Denmark and Norway were quickly occupied by the Nazis. Thus, it was not until the early summer of 1940 that the long-awaited invasion of France was initiated. On the 10th of May, the Germans made their initial move into Belgium and the Netherlands, as planned originally. Then, as the French and the British Expeditionary Force moved northeast to engage them in Belgium, a second pincer attack was launched through the Ardennes into northeastern France, as von Manstein had counselled. The weeks that followed would prove exactly how effective this strategy was. The British and the French were not able to deal with the ferocity of the German onslaught in mid-May 1940. Divisions of German troops, led by groups of panzer tanks, which never seemed to stop moving day or night, charged westwards at their lines. Within a week or so, the German front lines were nearing the English Channel. Even back in Berlin, Hitler was astonished by the speed of the army's advance. As a result of it, von Manstein's plan had largely worked. The British Expeditionary Force and much of the French army now found themselves trapped between two separate German armies, one in Belgium and one in northeastern France, which had proceeded into the country following the Ardennes strategy von Manstein championed. Faced with this impossible situation, the British began retreating to the port town of Dunkirk, which they still held, desperate to remove their forces from France back to Britain, a feat that was achieved in the space of a week in late May and early June. Over 330,000 British soldiers were evacuated, a feat made possible by a combination of the desire of Hermann Goering, one of the senior Nazi leaders, to claim the glory for himself by having his Luftwaffe effectively bomb the expedition into oblivion while trapped in Dunkirk, along with distractions created by the remnants of the French army elsewhere in northeast France, and the sheer daring of the British rescue operation, one which involved hundreds of merchant ships and fishing boats. It was only for this reason that von Manstein's plan had not achieved total success in capturing the British expeditionary force in its entirety. The Germans entered Paris on the 14th of June 1940. The French government had fled into exile days earlier, and the city was taken unopposed. Thereafter, France was divided into an occupied zone in the north and west, and a region in the south and east, which was handed over to a collaborationist French regime based out of the town of Vichy. No sooner were they ensconced in Paris than German attentions turned towards defeating Britain. As an island with a more substantial navy than Germany's, this would prove altogether more difficult. There were competing arguments as to how Germany should proceed within the Army High Command. One faction believed an extended blockade of Britain by sea and air should be used to force the country into submission, but others favoured a brief bombing campaign followed by an amphibious landing across the English Channel. This would knock Britain out of the war quickly and ensure that Germany did not have to worry about a threat in Western Europe before it turned eastwards again. Von Manstein was in favour of this latter strategy, but he, like all others who supported it, were overruled in October 1940, when Hitler ultimately took the decision to postpone the invasion of Britain and instead begin preparing for an invasion of the Soviet Union to the east. By this time, von Manstein had been promoted to the rank of a full general and had been awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in recognition of his contribution to the invasion of France. He was also appointed as the commander of 56th Panzer Group in March 1941 as part of the planning for what would eventually be termed Operation Barbarossa, named after a medieval German emperor. This was the tactical plan for the invasion of the Soviet Union, the largest land military operation ever undertaken. It would involve over 3.5 million German army personnel and over 600,000 motorized vehicles. By now, Hitler and his generals were convinced of the merits of short, fast campaigns, where they quickly overwhelmed their enemies. As such, the plan for Operation Barbarossa was to invade the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, proceeding east and northeast, taking cities like Kiev along the way, and ultimately seizing Leningrad and Moscow before the winter set in. With this done, the Russians would almost certainly capitulate like the French before them. Von Manstein was assigned to the Northern Wing, Army Group North, which was to thrust through the Baltic states before ultimately moving to capture Leningrad. Operation Barbarossa was an enormous success to begin with. From its first launching on the 22nd of June 1941 through to September 1941, the Germans advanced rapidly, taking huge tracts of land in eastern Poland, the Baltic states and Ukraine, and capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war and thousands of tanks and armored vehicles as they went. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin even considered negotiating a peace whereby his government would acknowledge Germany in its possession of these regions. Von Manstein's army group covered less land owing to its operational objective to move towards Leningrad. Nevertheless, this was a region where some of the densest Russian troop presence was found, and it was not unusual that they encountered stiff resistance. By the late summer, his unit was preparing for a descent on Leningrad, but met with counterattacks by the Russian Red Army. There were victories in this for von Manstein, notably the encirclement and capture of a unit of some 12,000 Soviets and 140 tanks in Staraya, Russia in mid-August, but also some setbacks. Ultimately, as the Russian positions were increasingly reinforced, the German advance slowed in the autumn. Von Manstein's forces were in Novgorod, just south of Leningrad, when he received news on the 12th of September that he had been promoted to the command of the German 11th Army, hundreds of kilometers away in Ukraine. Von Manstein had been promoted to oversee the 11th Army after its previous commander, Colonel General Eugen Ritter von Schobert, was killed in a plane crash. Von Schobert had been preparing for an assault on the Crimean Peninsula in southeastern Ukraine, in particular by seizing the major port city of Sevastopol. The region was strategically important as it guarded the route from Russia to Romania, a key ally of the Nazis from which Germany received a huge proportion of its oil supplies. The Crimea needed to be secured in order to prevent any effort by the Russians to launch a counterattack into Romania. This task was now handed over to von Manstein, who quickly sent his forces, numbering approximately 200,000 strong, and a major division of Romanian troops into the peninsula. Crucially, though, they lacked major air support. Despite this impediment, the Russians fell back speedily on Sevastopol itself, and by the early winter, nearly all of the Crimean peninsula was in German hands. However, the town would take longer to capture. A lengthy siege occurred at Sevastopol, one which von Manstein initiated in November 1941, but which would drag on until the summer of 1942. In part, this owed to the onset of the cold Russian winter. This was not harsh in the southerly climes of the Black Sea, but further to the north, the German advance was stalling outside Leningrad and Moscow in what would prove to be the first serious setback the German armed forces had yet experienced during the war. Von Manstein's plans for capturing Sevastopol were further delayed in the early winter of 1941 by the onset of severe rains, which delayed the German attack on the city. Then, when an assault was finally launched on the 17th of December, it was quickly hindered by a Russian counter-offensive as an amphibious expedition landed on the eastern side of the Crimean Peninsula, a region known as the Kerch Peninsula. Von Manstein and his fellow officers had specific commands from Hitler not to fall back from the Kerch Peninsula, ones which were disobeyed in the face of the heavy Russian counterattack in the dying days of 1941, giving the Russians control of a beachhead here in eastern Crimea. As a result of the new front in the east of the peninsula, the major assault on Sevastopol was once again put on hold to deal with the threat on the Germans' eastern flank. What followed was months of bloody conflict as the Russians heavily reinforced the Kerch beachhead and attempted to drive the 11th Army out of the Crimean Peninsula entirely. It was ultimately a very costly failure. Von Manstein's men stood firm, and the attrition rate amongst the Russians was catastrophic, indeed as it was all across the Eastern Front during the war. As they launched sortie after sortie against the German lines in the late winter and early spring of 1942, hundreds of thousands of Russian troops were lost. Von Manstein's 11th Army lost tens of thousands, but the number was only a percentage of the deadly death toll on the Russian side. By the late spring, the Russians were demoralized and much reduced in number. This was also the occasion for Hitler to finally acquiesce to von Manstein's repeated requests to be granted substantial air support in the Crimean Peninsula. In early May, the 800 planes of the German 8th Air Corps were dispatched to the Crimea under the command of Wolfram von Richthofen. These proved decisive in the weeks that followed in allowing von Manstein to finally take the offensive against the Russian 44th, 47th and 51st Army's position on the Kerch beachhead. With von Richthofen's planes flying over 1,500 sorties a day and the Germans battering their position with artillery, the Russians were effectively sitting ducks. Thus, by the time the Kerch beachhead was secured by the Germans on the 19th of May, the death toll against the Russians from the Kerch offensive had topped 500,000 men. And with this done, von Manstein was finally free to turn his attentions back to Sevastopol. With the support of the 8th Air Corps and without any further distractions to the east, he was quickly able to seize the city after a siege of a few weeks in the early days of July. Thus, after a grueling 8-month campaign, the peninsula was finally fully under German control. What was perhaps most striking about von Manstein's command of the 11th Army during the Crimean campaign was the ratio of casualties on both sides. Von Manstein's men had comprehensively defeated a numerically superior enemy, losing less than 1 man for every 5 Russians who perished. Yet there were many casualties besides. The brutal Einsatzgruppen, whose sinister work von Manstein would have become aware of back in Poland in the autumn of 1939, were again brought into operation in the Crimean Peninsula, as they were all across Ukraine and Russia in 1941 and 1942, as the German army advanced. Unlike in Poland, von Manstein was actually in charge of operations here, yet there is no evidence to suggest that he tried to obstruct these brigades of SS troops in their activities. Indeed, the Einsatzgruppen involved were supplied with vehicles, ammunition and other supplies directly by the 11th Army. There is no doubting that von Manstein knew exactly what they were doing, and that many of his own troops were guilty of atrocities as well during the Crimean campaign. All of this is significant in terms of claims von Manstein would later make about the German army being largely innocent of the crimes the Nazi regime was perpetrating, such as the Holocaust of Europe's Jews, which was just being initiated as the Crimean campaign was underway. Von Manstein's effectiveness in overcoming superior numbers had been noticed by Hitler, and he was ordered north within days of victory in Crimea to Leningrad, the siege of which city had stalled the previous winter and which had settled into a stalemate. He arrived there in late August, but it would prove a short-lived sojourn in the north. First, a Russian counteroffensive limited the possibility of a quick German victory there that autumn, but more significant were developments to the south. In the summer of 1942, Hitler and the generals had determined on a new strategy for winning the war in the east, codenamed Case Blue. The new plan was to strike into southern Russia in order to secure the rich oil fields of the Caucasus, which would both provide a boon to the German war effort and economy, and also massively reduce the supply of oil available to the Russians. This, it was imagined, could bring about the complete collapse of the Soviet war effort and ultimate victory for Germany in the war. A daring strategy such as this was needed, as the United States had entered the war in December 1941 on the side of Britain and the Soviet Union, and the campaign Germany was undertaking with Italy in North Africa was souring as well. It was clear that the drift of the war was turning in the favor of the Allies, and so the Nazis needed to take measures which would tip the balance in Eastern Europe back in their favor. Case Blue was that strategy, but it would necessitate seizing a key site in southern Russia, the city of Stalingrad. Von Manstein was not appointed to the overall command of activities in Stalingrad. That ultimately dubious honor fell to Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the German Sixth Army. With an initial force of over 250,000 men and 500 tanks, Paulus had moved towards Stalingrad in late August 1942 and had succeeded in securing most of the city on the west bank of the River Volga by mid-September. However, thereafter, their advance on the eastern side of the river stalled as the Russians had reinforced their position here considerably. A massive buildup of troops thus commenced in September and into October, as both sides began channeling huge resources into what was increasingly viewed as the crucible in which the fate of the war on the Eastern Front would be decided. Violent clashes occurred across the city in the early weeks of the battle, but it was not until mid-November when the Soviets launched a huge offensive codenamed Operation Uranus that the Battle of Stalingrad entered its most bloody stage. The Russian strategy was to encircle Paulus's Sixth Army in Stalingrad by moving north and south of the city and then circling back to strike at the German rear, which was largely held by the near 200,000 Romanian allies who were fighting with the Germans at Stalingrad by this time. These were weaker troops who were more vulnerable to a Russian offensive, and there was now a possibility that Paulus would be surrounded and cut off within the city. In response to these developments, Hitler ordered the creation of a new army group, Army Group Don. Von Manstein, who by now held the title of a full field marshal, the highest general rank within the German military command, was appointed to command it on the 21st of November 1942. In the weeks that followed, as he planned a counteroffensive codenamed Operation Winter Storm, the Russians completed the encirclement of Paulus's Sixth Army in Stalingrad. They were now cut off from the German lines by land, but Hitler and the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, were convinced that Paulus could be supplied by air for months to come. Stalingrad, the Führer commanded, was not to be abandoned, and no breakout through the Russian lines should be attempted. Thus, von Manstein's effort to break through the Russian lines from without and end the encirclement of Paulus's men was launched on the 12th of December 1942. However, despite some initial successes on the first days of the initiative, By the end of the first week of the counterattack, it was clear that the Russian perimeter was too strong for von Manstein's Army Group Don to break through. Accordingly, on the 18th of December, he sent a request to Hitler that Paulus should be allowed to attempt a breakout and abandon Stalingrad. Hitler refused. After the initial onslaught in mid-December and the failure of it, there was little that von Manstein's forces could do, as the Russians continued to pump ever greater numbers of men into the lines surrounding Stalingrad. And as they were reinforced, the possibility of Paulus attempting any breakout with the nearly 250,000 troops he had under his control in the city itself became ever more remote. Moreover, additional Russian counteroffensives were now being mounted to capture cities such as Rostov. In response to these and the futile situation which now obtained in Stalingrad, von Manstein was placed in charge of a new Army Group South, made up of Army Group Don and the remnants of other divisions, in early February 1943. This was just as Paulus and his men, over 200,000 of them, starving and disease-ridden by now, surrendered in Stalingrad to the Russians, who surrounded them on all sides. It was the first time a German field army was entirely defeated in the war, and was a symbol of how the Germans were now hurtling towards defeat. The war for the remainder of 1943 was a mixed affair. For instance, in the north, the siege of Leningrad continued and was not fully broken until January 1944. However, to the south the Russians were advancing westwards, but without a second front open anywhere in Europe as of yet, the Germans still had reserves with which to launch a new counteroffensive themselves. This would be aimed at securing the Kursk salient, a few hundred kilometers to the southwest of Moscow. Von Manstein was given one of the senior-most roles in this initiative, on which the last desperate German hope of victory in the east now rested, in part because he had yet again secured a quick but significant victory after being placed in charge of Army Group South in recapturing Kharkov in a 4-week battle there in February and March 1943, at the end of which the casualty rate was 8 times greater on the Russian side than on von Manstein's side. In its aftermath, Hitler began committing much of Germany's remaining resources to von Manstein's efforts to counterattack into Kursk in what would become known as Operation Citadel. In retrospect, the strategic thinking behind the counterattack on the Kursk salient seems baffling. Hitler was informed by his generals that he would be much better off pulling back from Russia and engaging in a strategic defense of Poland and Ukraine. But he nevertheless went ahead with the strategy, hoping for some miracle breakthrough. When Operation Citadel was launched on the 5th of July, von Manstein commanded the southern wing, with Field Marshal Walter Model commanding the north. Despite committing over 750,000 men, nearly 3,000 tanks, and over 9,000 artillery units to it, the Germans were outnumbered by Russian forces numbering over 1.5 million troops and over 5,000 tanks. Moreover, the Russians had ample advance warning of what the German plan was, and had dug trenches and planted mines all across the Kursk salient in advance of the attack. This was owing to the British having intercepted intelligence of the operation, which they passed on to their Russian allies. Thus, when the offensive began, it soon ran into a quagmire, difficulties which were compounded by the arrival of news that the Western Allies had initiated the opening of a second front in Europe by invading Sicily on the 9th of July. Thus, Hitler called off the offensive just days later, but it would take weeks before von Manstein could fully extricate his forces from the vicious fighting across the salient. Kursk remains the largest tank battle in history. With defeat at Kursk, and with any free troops being funneled towards Italy to deal with the invasion of the peninsula there, von Manstein and the other commanders in Eastern Europe were effectively fighting a rearguard action in the months that followed, desperately trying to stop the Russian advance with dwindling resources. By mid-autumn, this consisted of a steady retreat to the river Dnieper, during which war atrocities were again evidently committed by von Manstein's troops, with the destruction of the countryside to induce famine conditions. Here a line was held through the early winter of 1943. But von Manstein's pleas for reinforcements were falling on deaf ears with Hitler. as the Nazis prepared for the inevitable opening of a third front somewhere in Western Europe, one which would eclipse the southern front in Italy in scale. As a result, Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, lying on the Dnieper, fell to the Soviets in mid-November after a brief siege of less than 2 weeks. Inevitably, by January 1944, von Manstein was forced to completely abandon the defensive line which had been established along the course of the river. Moreover, with the breaking of the siege of Leningrad to the north, new Russian forces were now able to commence a westward drive into Poland. The war from early 1944 onwards was one of attrition as the Russians advanced from the east and the Western Allies advanced north through Italy, and from the summer of that year from France, where the Third Front was opened. There was no escaping the reality of German defeat by then. However, von Manstein did not spend it in service. In mid-March 1944, while he was still commanding the retreat across western Ukraine, Hitler had issued a command that all divisions everywhere were to fight to the death. There was to be no surrender. Von Manstein objected to this directive and was commanded to fly to meet Hitler in person. This he duly did at the Führer's mountain retreat, the Berghof, in Bavaria on the 30th of March 1944. There, the Nazi leader awarded von Manstein the Swords of the Knight's Cross, one of the highest honors bestowed on any member of the German military, before promptly dismissing him from his command. This was not in itself a highly unusual development, and Hitler had become highly volatile in his attitudes towards his military commanders in the final years of the war. Although he was not informed of it at the time, von Manstein was not to be reassigned to another command for the remainder of the conflict. Von Manstein spent the last year of the Second World War largely dealing with health concerns. He had developed a serious cataract problem in his eyes while serving on the Eastern Front, which he now had operated on. However, this led to an infection, and for a time there was a possibility that he would lose his vision. It was while he was recuperating back in Germany in the months that followed that the war entered its terminal stage. The Russians began to overrun Poland in the autumn of 1944, while at the same time the Western Allies advanced quickly through Western Europe, seizing Paris within weeks of landing in the north of the country that summer. By the end of the year, the situation was dire, with the Western Allies building up their forces in eastern France for an offensive into Western Germany early in 1945, and the Russians preparing to do the same in eastern Germany. Not even one last belated counteroffensive by the Germans through the Ardennes forest, where von Manstein had advised Hitler to send part of the German army 5 years previously, before the invasion of France, could yield much by way of results. Thus, in the spring of 1945, the noose began to tighten. In January 1945, von Manstein and his family, who had lost his son Gero in October 1942 on the Eastern Front, were forced to leave their home at Liegnitz as the Russian army advanced. They took refuge in Berlin, though it was only a temporary reprieve, as the German capital was the ultimate goal for both the Russians and the Western Allies. When he reached the capital, von Manstein attempted to arrange a personal meeting with Hitler to offer him his services as a military commander, but the Nazi leader, who was an increasingly drug-addled shell of a man, confined to the chancellery bunker in the center of the city, refused to grant him an audience. As a result, the von Mansteins continued to move west to avoid being entangled in the Battle of Berlin, which commenced in mid-April 1945. They eventually settled, like many other high-ranking members of the Nazi Party and German military, near the Danish border, well out of harm's way. It was here, while again receiving medical treatment, that von Manstein would have received news that Hitler had killed himself in Berlin on the 30th of April 1945. Just over a week later, on the 8th of May, hostilities ceased in Europe. In the weeks that followed, people who were connected with the regime from all over Germany were identified and arrested. Von Manstein was somewhat belatedly interred in August 1945, as a result of his having been receiving medical treatment at the time. Long before the war ended, the Western Allies had begun preparing for its aftermath. In particular, they were concerned with the prosecution of those who were responsible for the war crimes committed by the regime. By 1945, the casualties of these war crimes numbered well in excess of 10 million people, some 6 million being Europe's Jews, while millions of Romani, Poles, Russians, and other groups had also been mass murdered as slave laborers and prisoners of war who were not afforded proper treatment under the terms of the Geneva Convention. When one considers that the war had been caused almost exclusively by Germany, then the Nazi regime was culpable for the deaths of tens of millions of people. However, the Western Allies had determined that not all Germans would be held responsible for the country's crimes. A great proportion of Germans had never voted for the Nazi Party during its rise to power, or supported it after 1933. Moreover, the collective war guilt which had been imposed on Germany's population following the First World War had partly facilitated the rise of the Nazis. Consequently, by the time the war ended, it had been concluded that only those who were directly responsible for fomenting the war and committing crimes against humanity and war crimes would be prosecuted. This would include, as a matter of course, the surviving senior members of the Nazi regime and the Waffen-SS, who had run the concentration camps and made up much of the Einsatzgruppen. Within weeks of the war ending, trials were being organized to be held at the city of Nuremberg, where the Nazis had held their vast annual rallies when in power. From the inception of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, von Manstein, who was initially detained but whom it was quickly determined would not stand trial, was committed to defending the reputation of himself and the wider German army. In time, he would become the foremost proponent of what has become known as the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. This holds that the leaders of the German military were either unaware of the crimes being committed by the Nazis and the SS in the concentration camps and elsewhere across Europe between 1939 and 1945, or were not in any position to prevent what was happening. As part of his efforts in this regard, von Manstein appeared at the first trial at Nuremberg, that of the leaders of the regime such as Göring, the War Armaments Minister Albert Speer, and the Deputy Führer of the Nazi Party between 1933 and 1941, Rudolf Hess. There he testified against his former masters and also helped draft a 132-page document which tried to exonerate the Wehrmacht and attribute all of the guilt for the war to the Nazi Party and the SS. In this light, von Manstein and his co-author Siegfried Westphal presented the German High Command as being military officers who were following the chain of command. Von Manstein and Westphal claimed that it was the Nazis, not the German military, who were responsible for the Holocaust and the mass murder of millions of civilians and prisoners of war on the Eastern Front, acts which were perpetrated by the Einsatzgruppen and other elements. Indeed, von Manstein even stated that he had disobeyed many orders where they contravened the accepted rules of war. Thus was born the myth of the clean Wehrmacht, one which was augmented and added to by many other senior military commanders. The myth did not last fully intact for long. Von Manstein left Nuremberg in 1946, feeling as though he had rescued his own reputation and that of many of his fellow officers from ignominy. But no sooner had the trials of the Nazi leadership and heads of the SS concluded that many people began reconsidering the role of the Wehrmacht in the horrors of the war. Archival evidence which clearly showed generals such as von Manstein receiving orders which contravened the accepted rules of war and then acting on them were uncovered, and the military's complicity in the murder of millions of people on the Eastern Front was revealed. It was, for instance, clear that von Manstein had been perfectly aware of the actions of the Einsatzgruppen in the regions where he was commanding on the Eastern Front throughout the war. Accordingly, in 1948, the British arrested von Manstein. Having been pressured to do so by the Soviets, he was placed on trial, along with several other senior commanders of the Wehrmacht, in the autumn of 1949. There, he faced nearly 20 different charges, all relating to his conduct as a commander on the Eastern Front, notably following the invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941. At this trial, it was clearly demonstrated using documentary evidence and the testimonies of those who had served with von Manstein between 1941 and 1944 that he had agreed in principle with the Nazi High Command in its desire to exterminate both the Jews and many groups of Eastern Europeans. Accordingly, after a trial which lasted several months, von Manstein was found guilty of 9 different crimes and sentenced to 18 years in prison. Despite the length of his sentence, von Manstein would only ever serve just over 3 years in prison. His term was first commuted to 12 years early in 1950, and then he was released early in May 1953. There were many reasons why his sentence was drastically reduced in this way. For one, his defense counsel during his trial, the British lawyer Reginald Thomas Paget, published a book in 1951 defending his now convicted client and his record, while there was a general policy in the early 1950s of releasing German war criminals early, as West Germany became a key Western ally in the intensifying Cold War between the US and its allies on one hand and the Soviet Union on the other. Thus, von Manstein was released after serving only a fraction of his sentence. Thereafter, he was quickly brought on as a military advisor to the West German government in its creation of a new army to stave off the threat from communist East Germany. In 1955, he also published a memoir in which he yet again attempted to exonerate himself and the Wehrmacht from the crimes of the Nazi regime. He did not die until the 9th of June 1973 from a stroke at the age of 85. When he did, he was buried with full military honors in West Germany. Erich von Manstein is one of the most intensely debated figures within the German military command during the Second World War. There is no doubting his military capabilities. These were recognized early on, and he was one of the small number of German military officers who were retained when the much-reduced Reichswehr was formed in the aftermath of the First World War. He rose steadily through the ranks, and when the Second World War was eventually entered into in 1939, he was in a position to offer his advice to the central planning offices. As a result, he was able to profoundly influence the strategy used in invading France in the summer of 1940 by advancing through the Ardennes region rather than along a more northerly route in Belgium. Consequently, von Manstein was perhaps responsible more than any other individual, with the exception of the German tank commander Heinz Guderian, for the astonishing military victory which the Germans won over the French in May and June 1940. Thereafter, he was promoted and served in many senior capacities on the Eastern Front, leading the Crimean campaign, playing a major role at Stalingrad, and throughout the German retreat across Eastern Europe in 1943. While his major successes were largely confined to his role in the invasion of France and the victory in the Crimean campaign, there is no doubting von Manstein's abilities as a military commander. However, it is not his ability as a commander that has been the source of debate concerning him. Rather, von Manstein's career has been widely contested, owing to his central role in the formation of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. No sooner was the war over in the summer of 1945 than the general began cooperating with the Allies and producing reports which all aimed to alleviate the guilt of the German military high command and place the blame for the Nazis' atrocities firmly on the shoulders of the Nazi party leadership itself and groups such as the Waffen-SS. He was initially quite successful in this and escaped prosecution himself for several years, and even when he was finally convicted and sentenced, von Manstein served only a fraction of this time and was quickly rehabilitated afterwards. Moreover, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht remains a powerful feature in assessing the German military during the war down to this day. It may well be that aspects of it applied to some of the main German commanders, several of whom resigned their positions or did their level best to obstruct Nazi policy in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. But that is hardly the case with von Manstein. His views were, broadly speaking, in line with those of the Nazis in being rabidly anti-Semitic and perceiving the peoples of Eastern Europe from the perspective of German racial superiority. It is hardly surprising, then, to find that he was responsible for committing widespread atrocities himself in Poland, Ukraine, and Russia between 1939 and 1944. Thus, for all that von Manstein attempted to exonerate himself and his fellow generals, he was just as complicit in the crimes of the Third Reich as many of the Nazi leaders. What do you think of Erich von Manstein? Were his claims of the supposedly clean Wehrmacht, who were not responsible for the worst crimes of the Nazi regime, somewhat plausible, or was he just as culpable in conquering parts of Europe which the Nazis and SS then unleashed their genocidal policies on? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.